I still remember that afternoon as if time itself had stopped to humiliate me. The sun was high, pouring through the curtains, and I stood in my own living room like a stranger in a museum of memories. My daughter-in-law, Clara, was sitting on the couch, her legs crossed, her phone in hand, and that mocking smile on her lips. I had warned her about the way she handled money, the unnecessary parties, the designer bags, the investments that sounded too good to be true. She looked at me and laughed, as if wisdom were a thing of the past. "Don't worry, mother," she said, stretching the word mother with irony. "You're from another time. Things are different now." My son, Daniel, was standing beside her, avoiding my eyes, pretending to fix his watch. I felt something inside me tighten, like a rope pulling from the past, the same rope that had held our family together for generations. Her laughter echoed in my ears long after she left the room, twisting the silence into something cruel. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the house barefoot, hearing the creaks of the wooden floor under my feet. The same floor my husband built with his hands, the same home we filled with laughter and hard work. Now it felt empty, like someone had taken the soul out of it. I stopped in front of our old photograph on the wall and whispered, "If only you were here, you'd see how quickly people forget where they came from." The following morning, I noticed how the air in the house had changed. Clara had begun making small decisions, moving furniture, replacing old photos, changing curtains, as if to erase every trace of the past. My son, blinded by love or guilt, said nothing. I watched quietly, my hands trembling as I made my morning tea. There's a kind of power in silence, a power that those who mock it never understand. I wanted to believe she would learn her lesson through kindness, not consequence. But life has a way of revealing truths that pride tries to hide. Every smile of hers carried the scent of danger, a perfume too sweet to be innocent. I knew that kind of woman. I had seen her before, in stories told by neighbors, in lives destroyed by charm disguised as ambition. As I looked out the window that night, the city lights blinked in the distance, like distant warnings. I felt the chill of something inevitable. The house that once felt alive now held its breath, waiting for the storm. And deep in my heart, I knew that laughter, that single, arrogant laugh, would be the sound that marked the beginning of her downfall. Clara didn't move in. She arrived, like royalty entering a room that was secretly hers. She walked through my hallway with a tape measure and a smirk, measuring curtains she hadn't bought. "Open spaces breathe abundance," she said, already pushing aside my walnut console. Daniel followed, carrying boxes, asking where to put them as if I were the guest. I noticed the first decree when she snapped at him. "No shoes in the house. It's tacky." In 1 minute, my home became a set, and I, an extra waiting off camera. She began with small erasures. The lace doilies my mother crocheted, too sentimental. Then the family clock, outdated, wrapped in newspaper like a body. Our wedding photo left a pale rectangle on the wall, a ghost of eyes that once watched over us. She replaced the frame with an abstract canvas that looked like spilled wine. "I'm modernizing," she said, brushing invisible dust from her blouse. I learned that modernization sometimes means burying the past alive. Money followed decor, as it always does when ambition wears perfume. Clara proposed a simple system for household finances. Daniel nodded, relieved to be guided. She merged accounts, promised cashback miracles, and a new card with points for our future. I saw the first receipt: champagne, influencer brunch, a networking course sold by a woman half her age. She called it investing, the way gamblers call luck a strategy. Daniel smiled at the word future, while the present quietly bled. Control has many forms. Hers came with passwords and polite contempt. She changed the Wi-Fi name to New Era and didn't share the password for days. The maid who'd worked for me for 15 years didn't fit the new vibe and was let go. Clara took the spare keys for safety, though nothing had ever gone missing under my roof. She organized the pantry by color, then threw away the jars I'd preserved last winter. "Expired," she said, without checking dates. When pride judges, facts rarely matter. I tried diplomacy. Pride only hears victory or threat. Clara, your plans are ambitious. Maybe slow down. I offered, pouring tea into trembling cups. She smiled with all her teeth. You can relax now. I'm taking care of everything. The word everything carried the weight of a locked door. Daniel squeezed my shoulder. She means well, Mom, but didn't meet my eyes. A son who won't look at his mother is a man already half lost. That night I sat in the dark, listening to the house breathe in new rhythms. Clara's laughter rose and fell down the hallway like a ribbon of bright smoke. I prayed, not for her downfall, but for clarity. Because age taught me that storms don't announce themselves, they rearrange the furniture first. And when they finally speak, they do so in past tense. Everything was fine until it wasn't. By morning, the Queen had her throne, and the kingdom had already paid the tax. It started with whispers over dinner, the kind that make you wonder when your family became strangers. Clara spoke of opportunities with the confidence of someone reading from a script. She had joined a group, The Circle, a private network of women who multiplied wealth through connections. She said they were elite investors, and Daniel looked at her like she was a prophet. Every time I tried to ask where the money was going, she'd laugh softly and say, "You wouldn't understand. It's not the kind of business from your generation." I've seen many fashions come and go, pyramids, promises, and polite thieves. There's always a new word for greed: networking, mentorship, growth. Clara attended weekly meetings dressed like success itself, dripping in confidence and perfume. She came home late, humming songs I didn't recognize, speaking of numbers exploding. Daniel beamed beside her, proud of his visionary wife. But vision without wisdom blinds faster than darkness ever could. Then came the remodels, new floors, smart locks, a fountain in the garden to attract abundance. They used the family savings, the fund my husband built for emergencies. When I objected, Clara smiled with her usual charm. It's not spending, it's reinvestment. You can't grow without risk. Risk, I thought, had a scent. It was the same as fear, only masked by perfume and expensive candles. She claimed the profits were coming soon, and Daniel believed every syllable. Weeks turned into months, and the house filled with packages, drones, tablets, luxury skincare. She called them business samples, though no business ever seemed to sell them. The circle grew secretive. Phone calls and whispers, messages deleted before sunrise. I caught Daniel once, pacing outside, holding his head, muttering, "She promised the returns this week. They just need more time." That phrase, "they just need more time," is the anthem of every crumbling dream. One evening, I found Clara crying in the kitchen. Mascara streaked her cheeks, her phone on the floor, the screen glowing with unpaid bills. She looked up, startled, and snapped, "Don't you dare say it." But I didn't. I just stood there, watching the empire of arrogance begin to collapse. She left the room, slamming the door, and I finally whispered to the empty air, "I warned you, child." But laughter was easier than listening. By the end of that week, Daniel stopped coming home for dinner. The phone calls grew short, the laughter disappeared, and the silence became unbearable. Clara claimed she could fix it all, that she had a plan. But I'd seen that look before, in gamblers, dreamers, and widows who refused to face truth. When pride builds a castle on lies, the rain doesn't take long to find the cracks. And I knew then, the storm I had prayed for clarity about was finally here. It happened quietly, the way disasters always do, not with thunder but with absence. One morning, Daniel sat at the table with a blank expression, scrolling through his phone. "Mom," he said, his voice hollow, the accounts frozen. He tried to laugh it off, but his fingers trembled. Clara rushed in, still wearing her robe, whispering about system errors and temporary holds. I had lived long enough to know when a system is lying and when a person is. By noon, the truth surfaced like a corpse. The circle had vanished, websites offline, numbers disconnected, social media erased. Clara's mentor, the woman who promised to turn women into investors, had fled the country. All the investments, gone. The new car, the smart locks, even the fountain, all bought with borrowed money from accounts now empty. Daniel buried his face in his hands as if darkness could hide his shame. Clara refused to accept it. "They'll fix it," she said, pacing like a trapped animal. "They wouldn't just disappear. They're successful women. They have influence." Her voice cracked under the weight of denial. I watched her tear through papers, receipts, passwords, chasing ghosts through digital ruins. Every sound in that house was the echo of something breaking. The dishes, the pride, the silence. When she finally stopped, her face was gray, her mascara like bruises. Daniel avoided me for days, ashamed to face the woman who had warned him. I didn't gloat, not because I wasn't tempted, but because I saw how defeat had already punished him. He looked older, smaller, as if years of hope had been ripped from his chest. "One night," he whispered, "I just wanted her to be happy." I touched his shoulder and said softly, "You can't buy happiness, son. And you can't build it on lies." He didn't answer, just stared at the floor, as if it could open and swallow the truth. Bills arrived like vultures, one after another, stamped in red. The renovation company demanded payment. The bank froze the line of credit. Even the gardener stopped coming. There was nothing left to trim but memories. Clara stopped wearing makeup and started wearing blame. She avoided mirrors and meals, locking herself in the guest room for hours. At night, I heard her sobbing through the wall, soft, broken, like glass cracking under pressure. That week, I found the old envelope with my husband's handwriting, our emergency savings, hidden years ago. I had forgotten about it until that moment, as if fate had been waiting for the right time. I counted the bills slowly, my hands trembling, and whispered, "This was supposed to save us." But even as I held that money, I knew it couldn't fix what was lost. Because some debts aren't financial, they're spiritual, born of arrogance and blindness. And those take far longer to pay. The silence in the house grew heavier than any argument could ever be. It lingered in every corner, pressing against the walls like humidity that refused to leave. Daniel barely spoke, moving like a ghost between the living room and the porch. He no longer looked at Clara the same way. The light in his eyes had turned to fog. Clara, once radiant and full of plans, now wandered around in her nightgown, avoiding mirrors. And I, the witness to it all, sat at the kitchen table, wondering when love had become so expensive. Meals became rituals of discomfort. Daniel would sit across from her, pushing food around his plate, and she'd scroll through her phone, pretending not to notice. There was no more laughter, no music, no plans, only receipts, silence, and unpaid bills. The woman who once ruled the house now trembled at the sound of the doorbell, afraid it was another collector. Once, I heard her whisper, "We'll start over," but her voice cracked halfway through. Even lies sound tired when repeated too many times. One night, Daniel burst into my room, eyes red and wild. "She sold my car," he said, voice shaking. "Without asking me. She said we needed the money." It wasn't the car that broke him. It was the betrayal hidden behind that decision. He had trusted her with everything, his finances, his pride, his future. Now, all he had left were broken promises and a mortgage on memories. He sank to the floor, and I held him, just like I did when he was a boy who scraped his knees. Clara avoided me entirely after that. She'd slip in and out of the house like a shadow, taking calls and whispers. Once, I caught her packing a suitcase and she froze, eyes full of guilt. "It's not what you think," she said, zipping it shut. "I'm going to fix things." But her voice betrayed her. It trembled the way people's voices do when they're already halfway gone. And I knew deep inside, she wasn't fixing anything. She was running. Days later, the first court notice arrived. Debts in Daniel's name, some he'd never even seen before. Credit cards, loans, business accounts, all signed under their joint information. I watched his face as he read, pale as paper, the ink reflecting in his eyes. He didn't yell or cry. He just folded the letter neatly and whispered, "It's all gone." That calm tone is how real heartbreak sounds, Not loud, but hollow. That evening, I walked into the empty kitchen and found one of Clara's notes on the counter. It was short. "I'm sorry. I'll make it right." But there was no signature, no destination, no promise that meant anything anymore. I looked around the house, stripped, echoing, cold, and realized something brutal. She hadn't just taken the money, she'd taken the meaning out of everything. And for the first time, I wasn't angry. I was just tired. Clara disappeared on a Thursday morning, the kind of day when nothing seems unusual. The coffee pot still warm, her perfume still hanging in the hallway. Her suitcase was gone, along with a few pieces of jewelry and the last of Daniel's savings. At first, he thought she'd gone to her sister's house, or maybe to the bank to settle things. But as the hours passed, the calls went unanswered, and the silence grew sharp enough to cut. By nightfall, even denial had packed its bags and left with her. Daniel called everyone, her friends, co-workers, even the women from the circle. No one knew anything or pretended not to. One of them finally confessed. "She wasn't who you think she was." The words landed like stones. It turned out Clara had been living a double life, another name, another city, another web of promises. The truth wasn't shocking to me. It was confirmation of every instinct I had swallowed for peace. The police came the next day. A polite officer took notes, nodding as if this were just another story in a long list of broken hearts. He explained that people like her knew how to vanish: offshore accounts, fake IDs, prepaid phones. Daniel kept insisting she must have been tricked too, still trying to rescue the image of the woman he loved. But I saw it clearly. She had burned the bridge before crossing it. And he was still standing on the ashes, waiting for her to return. Days turned into weeks. The mail brought more debts. The phone brought more silence. I tried to feed Daniel, but he barely touched his food. Sometimes he'd sit by the window all night, whispering, "She'll come back. She has to." But the kind of people who laugh at warnings don't come back for forgiveness, only for opportunity. And there was nothing left for her to take. I cleaned her empty room one morning, out of instinct more than duty. In the bottom drawer of her nightstand, I found a photograph, Clara with another man, both smiling in front of a car I'd never seen. On the back, written in her elegant script, "New beginnings." I sat on the edge of the bed, the weight of irony pressing on my chest. She had planned her escape long before the storm hit. And Daniel, poor Daniel, had mistaken the thunder for applause. That evening, he walked into the kitchen with a calm I didn't recognize. "She's not coming back," he said softly, staring into his coffee. There was no anger, no sorrow, only emptiness. He picked up his wedding ring and placed it on the table like a final payment. Then he looked at me and whispered, "You warned me, Mom." And though he didn't say it, I knew he was really asking if he could ever forgive himself. The morning after Daniel admitted the truth, the house felt like a hollow shell. Every sound seemed amplified. The tick of the clock, the creak of the floor, even my own breathing. For years, that place had been filled with life, laughter, arguments, the smell of fresh bread, and my husband's old records. Now, only the echo of what once was remained, haunting the walls like an unfinished song. Daniel moved through the rooms like a ghost, opening drawers as if searching for her shadow. But shadows don't return what love blinds us to lose. I found him in their bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed, holding one of her scarves. It still carried her scent, faint, artificial, expensive. He clutched it so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "She made it all look so real," he murmured. I thought we were building something." I wanted to tell him that illusions are always perfectly built until they collapse. But instead, I just sat beside him and let silence do the talking. Days blurred together, marked only by unpaid bills and the slow decay of routine. I'd find unopened mail stacked by the door, dishes left in the sink, and lights burning all night. The house had lost its rhythm, like a body without a heartbeat. I tried to bring it back, cleaning, cooking, opening windows to let the sun in. But sunlight only made the emptiness more visible. Sometimes healing begins not with light, but with acceptance of the dark. Neighbors stopped by at first, bringing casseroles and cautious sympathy. But pity fades faster than gossip, and soon the visit stopped. The story of Daniel and Clara had become just another whispered tragedy in a small town. I could feel their eyes on us when we walked to the market, curiosity disguised as concern. Daniel hated leaving the house, so he stayed inside, trapped between shame and sorrow. I knew the look. It was the same my husband wore when the factory closed decades ago. One afternoon, I found Daniel staring at the garden fountain, the one Clara had insisted on buying to attract abundance. The water was stagnant now, leaves floating on the surface like forgotten dreams. He said softly, "I think she cursed this house." I smiled sadly.
"No, son."
She only revealed what was already broken. That's the cruel beauty of deception. It doesn't destroy, it exposes. He looked at me as if hearing those words made something inside him finally shift. That night, as I walked down the hallway, I paused by their room, now stripped of life. The walls were bare, the bed unmade, the air still carrying a faint trace of her perfume. I closed the door gently, as if sealing a tomb. Then I whispered to the quiet, "Let her memory rest here, and nowhere else." Because some rooms aren't meant to be reopened. They're meant to remind us. Remind us of how fragile trust becomes when love is given without discernment. It began with the first knock, sharp, deliberate, the kind that doesn't wait for permission. I opened the door to find a man in a dark suit holding a clipboard. "Mrs. Alvarez?" he asked. I nodded. "We're here about outstanding payments under Mr. Daniel Alvarez's name." Behind him stood two others, silent and cold as statues. In their eyes, I saw not cruelty, but routine, as if collecting broken dreams were just another day's work. That was the morning I realized the storm hadn't passed. It had only changed shape. They spoke politely, almost kindly, but their words were knives wrapped in velvet. Numbers, deadlines, legal terms, a foreign language of loss. Daniel stood behind me, pale, barely able to breathe. He tried explaining that the debts weren't his, that his wife had used his name without consent. The man simply shrugged and said, "It doesn't matter, sir. The papers are signed." I watched my son crumble in silence, as if each word stole a year of his life. Days later, more letters arrived, thicker, heavier, uglier. Each envelope a reminder of how fragile stability truly is. There were threats of repossession, property seizures, even lawsuits. I read them all in the kitchen, the same table where Clara once laughed about her business empire. Now it was a battlefield covered in ink and desperation. I kept the worst letters hidden from Daniel. Some wounds don't need witnesses. The collectors became part of our routine. Calls at dawn, knocks at dusk, men with clipped voices and dead smiles. They circled like vultures, feeding on the scent of fear. Daniel started avoiding the door altogether, shutting himself in his room for hours. Once, I found him staring at the unpaid notices, whispering, "I can't do this anymore." I wanted to tell him he could, but the words felt too light for the weight he carried. I sold my jewelry quietly, piece by piece. The gold bracelet my husband gave me on our wedding day went first. Then the earrings I'd saved for Clara's birthday. Ironic, considering how little she valued anything real. It wasn't enough, but it kept the lights on. When I handed the bills to the collectors, they thanked me with blank expressions. Gratitude means nothing in a world built on interest rates and signed lies. One evening, after the last collector left, I found Daniel sitting in the dark, head in his hands. "I ruined everything," he said, his voice small, like a child lost in the woods. I placed my hand on his shoulder and whispered, "No, son. You trusted the wrong person. That's not ruin. That's human." He looked up, tears carving paths down his face. In that moment, I realized forgiveness isn't just for the guilty, it's for the survivors too. Because if we don't forgive ourselves, we become the ghosts of our own mistakes. The letter came on a Monday morning, slipped under the door like a quiet execution. I almost didn't open it. Something in the weight of the envelope warned me that no good news ever feels that heavy. When I finally unfolded the papers, my hands began to tremble. Bold letters at the top read, "Notice of foreclosure and auction." Our home, the one my husband had built, the one Daniel had grown up in, was scheduled to be sold. Not even the air seemed to move after that. It was as if the house itself had stopped breathing. Daniel stood frozen when I handed him the notice. He read it once, twice, then looked at me like a man waking from a nightmare. "This can't be happening," he whispered. "We'll lose everything, Mom." His voice cracked, and I saw the boy he once was, the boy who believed his parents could fix anything. But I was old enough to know that some storms can't be stopped, only endured. He sat down, burying his face in his hands, while I stared at the walls that had witnessed our entire lives. Neighbors started whispering again, as if misfortune were contagious. Some offered help, others offered pity, and both felt equally heavy. I caught snippets at the grocery store. "Such a shame," she warned them. "That woman ruined them." They weren't wrong, but truth without compassion becomes cruelty. I walked home slowly that day, feeling the weight of every brick, every nail that once held our dreams together. There's nothing lonelier than watching your world shrink one rumor at a time. Daniel tried everything: calls to lawyers, letters to the bank, even meetings with strangers promising miracle solutions. Each one ended the same way: more paperwork, more despair. He stopped shaving, stopped eating, stopped believing. One night, I found him asleep at the kitchen table, surrounded by letters and unpaid bills. The lamp cast a soft light over his face, and I realized how much he looked like his father. Except my husband's eyes had always carried hope. Daniel's carried defeat. I spent that night walking through the house room by room, saying silent goodbyes. To the dent on the wall where Daniel had learned to ride his first bike. To the kitchen counter where my husband used to leave me love notes written on grocery receipts. To the garden Clara once called old-fashioned, but where I had planted roses for 40 years. Each memory was a thread, and I could feel them all snapping one by one. By dawn, I understood that losing a home isn't just losing a roof, it's losing a lifetime. The auction was scheduled for 3 weeks later. Daniel wanted to fight it. I wanted to prepare for the inevitable. We spent those days in silence, each of us grieving differently. He buried himself in paperwork. I buried myself in memories. But beneath the grief, a strange calm began to grow inside me. Because sometimes, when life strips everything away, it's not punishment, it's purification. The morning of the auction dawned gray, as if even the sky refused to witness what was about to happen. I woke before sunrise, not because of nerves, but because the house itself seemed to call me one last time. The air smelled faintly of rain and old wood, the scent of endings. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, wearing the same wrinkled shirt he'd worn the day before. He hadn't said a word all morning. The silence between us was thicker than grief. When the clock struck 9, the knock came, punctual, cold, inevitable. The man at the door wore a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. He introduced himself as the representative from the bank, accompanied by 2 strangers with clipboards. They spoke in terms like liquidation, assets, valuation, words that turned our memories into numbers. I poured coffee for everyone, a pointless act of dignity, but it kept my hands from shaking. Daniel signed the papers with trembling fingers, and I felt the weight of each stroke of the pen. That's how legacies die, not with noise, but with signatures. Outside, a small group of buyers gathered under umbrellas. They looked at the house the way people look at property, not history. One man whispered to another, pointing at the garden. I wanted to scream that those roses were planted for love, not for resale value. But my throat wouldn't move. It's strange how grief can silence even the strongest souls. Daniel refused to attend the actual auction. He said he couldn't watch strangers raise their hands to buy the walls that held his childhood. So I stood alone at the gate, hidden behind the curtain of rain. The bidding was quick, almost merciful. Within minutes, our home had a new owner, a young couple with ambition in their eyes. I wondered if they knew they were buying a house still echoing with unburied ghosts. When everyone left, I walked through the empty rooms one last time. Every step echoed. Every memory clung to me like dust refusing to settle. I touched the kitchen wall where Daniel's height marks still faded under the paint. I traced them with my fingers, whispering, "You grew up here, my boy." Then I opened every window, letting the rain scent fill the house. It felt like baptism, cleansing what greed had defiled. As we closed the door for the last time, Daniel asked softly, "Where will we go now, Mom?" I didn't have an answer, only a trembling smile. "Wherever life still has room for us," I said. He nodded, his eyes distant, his spirit fractured but not fully broken. We walked away slowly, not looking back, because some goodbyes demand silence, not sorrow. And behind us, the rain kept falling, as if the heavens themselves were mourning with us. We found a small roadside motel that charged by the week, its sign flickering weakly between vacancy and darkness. It wasn't home, but it was all we could afford. The room smelled of detergent and forgotten dreams, the kind that never had the chance to come true. Daniel carried in 2 suitcases, one with clothes, the other with the remains of our life in folders and envelopes. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the peeling wallpaper, realizing how fast one can fall from comfort to survival. A lifetime of work reduced to a room with a single key. Daniel tried to stay strong, but his silence spoke louder than any breakdown could. He left every morning pretending to look for work, though I knew he was really walking aimlessly. I'd watch from the window, his figure shrinking along the highway until he vanished into the gray. He always came back by sunset, exhausted and quieter than before. Sometimes, I'd find him sitting in the parking lot, staring at the road as if expecting someone to return. But the only thing that ever returned was the wind. At night, I'd lie awake listening to the trucks roar by, each one carrying lives that were still moving forward. The sound made me feel both small and strangely calm, as if the world, despite our ruin, still had rhythm. I prayed silently, not for miracles, but for strength enough to endure another dawn. There's a peace that comes when you stop asking why and start whispering thank you for what remains. For me, that was my son, broken but still here. Sometimes survival itself is proof of grace. We learned the motel's small community quickly, people living between chances and second chances. A single mother with 2 kids, a truck driver who'd lost his license, an old man waiting for his pension to clear. Each had a story of loss that sounded different but felt the same. We'd exchange nods, small smiles, silent recognition of our shared exile. There's an unspoken brotherhood among the fallen. You stop judging and start understanding. Misery, I realized, teaches humility faster than any sermon. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Daniel returned with a paper bag of cheap groceries. He smiled faintly, almost like before. "We'll be okay, Mom. I promise." I wanted to believe him, but hope felt like a luxury we couldn't afford. Still, I nodded, because sometimes a mother's faith must fill the silence a son can't bear. We ate in silence, sharing the same plastic fork, our laughter replaced by memories. Yet beneath it all, a small flame of resilience began to flicker again. That night, I wrote in my old notebook, the one I hadn't touched since Clara's arrival. I wrote everything: the warning, the laughter, the fall, the loss. Each word felt like reclaiming a piece of myself she had stolen. I ended the page with a promise. This is not the end, only the reckoning. Because even in exile, the soul knows how to rebuild from ashes. And deep down, I sensed that life was preparing something neither of us expected. It was late, close to midnight, when the knock came. 3 slow, deliberate taps that sent a shiver through the thin motel walls. Daniel looked up from the bed, startled. We weren't expecting anyone. I hesitated before opening the door, instinct whispering that nothing good arrives at such an hour. When I did, I found a man standing under the flickering hallway light, soaked from the rain. He looked tired, but his eyes were sharp, the kind that had seen too much. "Mrs. Alvarez?" he asked, his voice calm but weighted. "Yes," I answered, clutching the doorknob tighter. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folder, its edges damp and worn. "I'm an investigator," he said. "You might want to sit down." Daniel came to the door, his face pale, suspicion and hope fighting for space in his eyes. The man continued, "It's about Clara." For a moment, time stopped. Even the hum of the neon sign outside seemed to fade into silence. Daniel whispered her name like a prayer and a curse all at once. The investigator opened the folder and showed us photographs. Clara, unmistakably, in another city. Different hair, new clothes, but the same smile, the same poison wrapped in silk. She's been working a new scheme, he said, under a different name. Daniel took a step back, trembling. You found her? The man nodded. Not just me. Several others she's deceived are looking for justice. He explained that Clara had resurfaced, targeting new victims, but this time the trail was catching up to her. There were pending charges, frozen accounts, and a warrant waiting for her arrest. Daniel's breathing grew uneven, torn between relief and rage. I could see it in his eyes, the painful satisfaction of seeing truth finally unmasked. The investigator placed a document on the small table. It was a statement, a formal request for Daniel's testimony, evidence that could link her to everything. He hesitated, hands trembling. I don't want revenge, he said quietly. I just want this to end. The man nodded. Sometimes justice is the only way for things to end. Before leaving, he looked at me and said softly, You warned her, didn't you? I nodded.
He sighed.
They never listened to wisdom until it cost them everything. After he left, Daniel sat in silence for a long time. The rain outside whispered against the window like an unfinished confession. He finally said, I don't know if I want to see her punished, or if I just want to forget. I placed my hand over his and replied, Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means freeing yourself. He nodded, tears gathering at the corners of his eyes. That night, for the first time in months, I saw my son sleep in peace. The summons came a month later, delivered in an envelope marked confidential. Daniel read it aloud, his voice trembling. He was required to testify in court against Clara. For days, he avoided the subject, pacing the motel room like a man haunted by memories. When he finally spoke, he said softly, I don't want revenge, Mom, but maybe this will give me peace. I nodded, though I knew peace was rarely found in places built for judgment. Still, sometimes facing your ghosts is the only way to stop them from following you. The courthouse was colder than I expected, sterile walls, humming lights, and faces that didn't care for stories, only evidence. We sat in the back row while lawyers whispered in corners, shuffling papers like gamblers handling cards. When they brought Clara in, time folded in on itself. She looked different, thinner, quieter, but her eyes still carried that same unrepentant fire. She saw Daniel and smirked faintly, a ghost of her former arrogance. And in that moment, I realized she still believed she could win. The prosecutor spoke of fraud, of false investments, of lives she had ruined across the country. Each name mentioned was another person who had believed in her lies, another home lost, another dream turned to ash. I watched Daniel's hands clench on the table, veins rising under his skin. When it was his turn, he stood slowly, voice steady, but eyes full of sorrow. She didn't just take my money, he said. She took my trust. And that's a debt no court can repay. His words fell heavy in the silence that followed. Clara refused to look at him after that. She stared at the floor as the judge read the charges: identity theft, fraud, deception. I thought I would feel vindicated, but all I felt was exhaustion. Seeing her there, stripped of her charm and power, made me realize something. Evil doesn't always come with horns. Sometimes it wears perfume and smiles. The punishment was inevitable, but the lesson had already been written in blood and tears. When the verdict came, guilty on all counts, the courtroom exhaled collectively. Clara didn't cry. She simply raised her chin, as if pride could still protect her from truth. Daniel looked at her one last time and whispered something I couldn't hear. Maybe it was goodbye, maybe it was forgiveness, I didn't ask. As they led her away in handcuffs, I noticed how her laughter, once so sharp, had finally died. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it ends in silence. Outside the courthouse, the air smelled of rain again, just like the day she left. Daniel stood there quietly, staring at the gray sky. I thought seeing her punished would make me feel better, he said. But it doesn't. I smiled softly. Because peace doesn't come from seeing others fall. It comes from standing again. He nodded, tears hidden behind a weary smile. And as we walked away, I realized we hadn't lost everything. We'd just begun to understand what truly mattered. 2 weeks after the trial, the world seemed to exhale for the first time in months. The motel felt less like exile and more like a waiting room for rebirth. Daniel had started working odd jobs again, repairing fences, painting houses, whatever kept his hands busy and mind quiet. I spent my mornings writing, my old notebook now filled with lessons I'd never meant to teach but had been forced to learn. Then, one afternoon, a new envelope arrived, this time with the bank seal. For a moment, my heart stopped. I had learned that news wrapped in paper could change everything. Daniel hesitated before opening it. He ran his fingers along the edge, afraid of what might spill out. Finally, he tore it open and began to read in silence. His eyes widened, not in fear this time, but disbelief. "Mom," he said slowly, "they've cleared the debt. The court recovered part of the money from Clara's accounts." I didn't move. I just stared at him, trying to grasp the meaning of words I never expected to hear again. The letter stated that a portion of the seized assets would go toward compensating the victims. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to start over, enough to breathe. Daniel sat down heavily, his voice breaking. After everything, I thought this would never happen. I placed my hand over his and whispered, "Maybe life isn't cruel. Maybe it just waits for us to be ready to begin again." For the first time in years, I saw something in his eyes that had long been buried. Hope. We went to the bank the next morning, the same place where we'd once signed our ruin. This time, the clerk smiled and handed Daniel a check, symbolic, modest, but powerful. It wasn't the money that mattered. It was what it represented. He held it like a sacred object, a fragment of redemption carved from chaos. As we left, he said, "I'm not buying anything with this, Mom. I'm going to rebuild, slowly, honestly." And in that moment, I knew the boy who had fallen had finally become a man. That evening, we walked to a small diner near the motel and ordered dinner. Nothing fancy, just warm food and laughter. The waitress smiled when she brought the bill, and Daniel handed her a tip larger than usual. She looked surprised, and he just said, "We're celebrating something small but important, peace." I watched him speak with calm, his voice steady, his eyes soft. Gratitude, I realized, makes even the simplest moment sacred. And sometimes, the richest people are the ones who've already lost everything once. Later that night, as I wrote in my notebook again, I added a new sentence to my story. Justice returned what greed had stolen, but forgiveness restored what pain had broken. I closed the book, letting those words rest like seeds waiting for spring. Outside, the highway lights flickered softly, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't fear tomorrow. We didn't have much, but we had peace, and that was wealth enough. Little did I know, a new chapter of our lives was already on its way. It was a quiet Sunday morning, sunlight slipping through the thin motel curtains, when the knock came again. This time, it wasn't heavy or urgent, just 3 gentle taps that carried a strange familiarity. Daniel was at work, and I was alone, sipping my coffee and reading my notebook. I hesitated before opening the door, my heart suddenly uneasy, without knowing why. When I did, I froze. Standing there, aged, thin, and trembling, was someone I never thought I'd see again. It was Clara. For a moment, the air left the room. She looked nothing like the woman who had once ruled our house with arrogance and charm. Her hair was dull, her clothes worn, her eyes hollow, but unmistakably hers. She gave a faint, almost nervous smile and said, "You have every reason to hate me." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind raced between fury and pity. Before I could speak, she continued, "I just needed to see Daniel, to tell him I'm sorry." I told her he wasn't home, though I wasn't sure I would have let her in even if he were. She nodded slowly, accepting rejection like someone who expected it. "I've lost everything," she whispered. They took it all, the money, the house, the friends. I'm just trying to survive. Her voice cracked on that last word, and for a moment, I saw not a monster, but a broken woman who had built her empire on lies. I came to return something, she said, pulling an old envelope from her bag. Inside were photographs, our families, the ones she'd taken when she left. I stared at them, unsure whether to cry or tear them apart. She looked down at her hands, ashamed, her voice trembling. I don't expect forgiveness. I just couldn't carry these anymore. She stepped back, preparing to leave, but I stopped her with a question that had haunted me for years. Why? I asked. You had everything. Why destroy it? She looked up, her eyes glistening, and said softly, because I never believed I deserved love unless I controlled it. Those words hung in the air like smoke, heavy and revealing. I let her walk away. No accusations, no closure, just silence. Through the window, I watched her disappear down the highway, swallowed by the sun's glare. There was no triumph in seeing her broken, only a deep, aching understanding. Some people are born lost, chasing validation through destruction, unable to recognize peace when it's offered. For years, I thought my warnings had failed. But now I saw the truth. Wisdom doesn't always save others. Sometimes, it just saves you. When Daniel returned that evening, I handed him the envelope. He stared at the photos for a long while, then asked softly, "Did she say anything?" I told him, and he nodded in silence, a single tear sliding down his cheek. "She's not the same person anymore," he whispered. "No," I said gently. "But maybe neither are we." And for the first time, I felt that the past, with all its wounds, had finally exhaled its last breath. Weeks passed after Clara's visit, and life began to move with a new rhythm, slower, calmer, but strangely full. Daniel found steady work with a construction company, rebuilding homes for people who'd lost theirs to storms. It was poetic, I thought, that he now helped others rebuild what he himself had lost. One afternoon, as we packed to move out of the motel, he asked quietly, "Mom, do you want to see the old neighborhood before we go?" For a moment, my heart clenched. I hadn't set foot there since the day of the auction. But something in me needed to see it, not as a wound, but as a lesson finally healed. When we arrived, the air felt familiar and foreign at once. The streets were the same, but quieter, as if time had swallowed the echoes of our past. Children played where Daniel once rode his bike, their laughter carrying over the fences. The old bakery still stood on the corner, though painted in new colors, with strangers behind the counter. Everything had changed, yet somehow remained the same, a cruel but beautiful paradox of life. I realized then that places don't grieve. Only people do. When we turned the corner and saw our former home, I stopped walking. The garden we once tended had blossomed wildly again. Someone cared for it. The new owners had painted the house white and hung wind chimes by the porch. Their gentle sound in the breeze was like a soft apology from the universe. I felt no resentment, only a quiet gratitude that the house still breathed, still held love. It wasn't ours anymore, but perhaps it never truly was. We were just its caretakers for a season. Daniel stood beside me, his hands in his pockets, staring at the windows that once framed our laughter. "She looks different," he said softly. I nodded. "She's alive again." He smiled faintly, his eyes glistening. "I used to think losing her was the end." I looked at him and said, "Sometimes losing everything is how life makes space for peace." He didn't answer, but I saw understanding settle on his face like sunlight after a long storm. We stood there for a long while, saying nothing, just listening to the wind and the chimes. I could almost hear the echoes of our past, my husband's laughter, Daniel's childhood questions, even Clara's misguided dreams. But they no longer hurt. They existed like distant music, faint but tender. Before leaving, I whispered under my breath, "Thank you for everything you gave and everything you took." The words weren't for the house alone. They were for life itself. Because sometimes gratitude is the only way to close a story without bitterness. As we walked back toward the car, Daniel turned to me. "Do you think Dad would be proud of us?" he asked. I smiled, feeling a tear slip down my cheek. "He already is. We didn't let pain make us cruel." He nodded, exhaling softly, as if releasing years of guilt. As we drove away, the chimes behind us sang one last note carried by the wind. And for the first time, I felt we weren't running from the past, we were walking into peace. After months of searching, Daniel found a small house for rent by a quiet lake a few towns away. It was nothing like our old home, smaller, humbler, but surrounded by silence that felt almost sacred. The first time we arrived, the air smelled of pine and still water, and the reflection of the trees rippled like a living painting. Daniel turned to me with a faint smile. "It's not much," he said, "but it's peaceful." I looked around and felt something I hadn't in years, serenity, without fear of losing it. Sometimes, life doesn't give you back what you lost. It gives you what you truly needed all along. The landlord, an elderly widower named Miguel, greeted us with warmth and a knowing look. He said, "This place has healed many people. Maybe it'll heal you too." There was something in his tone that felt more like a blessing than a statement. Inside, the house was simple: 2 bedrooms, wooden floors, a porch facing the water. No luxury, no ghosts, no memories of betrayal, just space to breathe. I unpacked slowly, realizing that every small action, folding clothes, placing a photo, was an act of rebuilding. Daniel took to fishing in the mornings, sitting quietly by the dock as mist rose from the lake. He said it helped him think, though I suspected it helped him stop thinking. Some mornings I'd join him, just to listen to the sound of water lapping against the wood. We didn't speak much. Grief had taught us the beauty of silence. Sometimes healing doesn't come from talking, but from simply being together without needing to explain. Each sunrise seemed to erase another scar, one gentle light at a time. I began tending a small garden beside the porch. Herbs, flowers, nothing grand. The first time I saw a sprout break through the soil, I smiled for no reason at all. It felt like a quiet reminder from the universe that life insists on returning, no matter how harsh the winter. Every leaf, every bud carried a message. Not all growth is visible at first. I wrote that in my notebook that night, beneath a line that said, "Peace is the slow bloom of acceptance." And for once, I believed it. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Daniel joined me on the porch. He brought 2 cups of tea and handed me one with a smile. "I've been offered a promotion," he said quietly. "They want me to lead a new project, building homes for displaced families." I looked at him, pride swelling in my chest. "So you'll build what we lost for others?" He nodded.
Exactly that.
It struck me then that life had not punished him, it had prepared him. That night, as the moon rose over the lake, I sat alone with my notebook open on my lap. The wind rustled through the trees, and the water shimmered like glass. I wrote, "We lost a house, but we found ourselves. We lost trust, but gained truth." The page felt final but not finished because healing like the lake has no edges. I closed the book, breathed deeply, and whispered, "Thank you for bringing us here." For the first time, I didn't mean it to anyone, I meant it to life itself. Forgiveness doesn't arrive all at once. It comes like dawn, slow, hesitant, and soft enough that you barely notice the darkness fading. For months, I believed I'd already forgiven Clara. I had spoken the words, written them in my notebook, even prayed them at night. But forgiveness, I learned, isn't something you decide. It's something that grows inside you when pain has nothing left to feed on. One morning, as I stood by the lake watching the mist dissolve, I felt it happen. No tears, no grand revelation, just a quiet release in my chest. It wasn't about her anymore. It was about freeing myself from her shadow. Daniel noticed the change before I did. He said I'd been smiling more, humming again while cooking, even laughing softly when he told his silly stories. We had started living again, without realizing it, our lives no longer built around survival, but around gratitude. He once told me, "You taught me how to let go without becoming bitter." I smiled and replied, "You taught me that even the broken can build again." Between us, Silence had turned from a wound into a shared peace. That week, I received a letter from the correctional facility where Clara was serving her sentence. It was short, written in uneven handwriting. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted to thank you for warning me. I finally understand what you meant. Some lessons only come when everything is gone. I stared at those words for a long time, not because I pitied her, but because I knew they were true. Wisdom often arrives too late, but at least it arrives. I folded the letter and placed it inside my notebook between pages stained with tears and ink. That night, I went to the lake alone. The air was cool, the sky clear, the stars reflected in the still water. I whispered her name, not in anger, but in release. Then I whispered mine and Daniel's and my husband's, letting each name float away on the wind. It felt like closing a book that had taken too long to finish. I realized then that forgiveness isn't a gift to the guilty. It's the soul's way of remembering that it was never meant to stay chained. The water shimmered, as if nodding in silent approval. When I returned home, Daniel was waiting on the porch, holding 2 cups of tea. He asked quietly, "Are you okay, Mom?" I smiled and answered, "For the first time, I think I truly am." We sat there without speaking, watching the reflection of the moon ripple on the lake. It felt as if the world itself had exhaled, releasing everything we had carried for too long. That night, forgiveness didn't feel like surrender, it felt like freedom. In the days that followed, I began writing again, not about pain, but about wisdom. Stories of loss that led to light, of laughter that became lessons. And at the end of each one, I left the same message for anyone who might read it one day. Be careful with pride, for it blinds faster than love heals. And never ignore the wisdom of those who've already walked through the storm. Because, in the end, forgiveness isn't forgetting, it's remembering without the weight. And that, I realized, was the truest kind of peace. Spring came early that year, as if life itself wanted to reward our endurance. The trees around the lake bloomed with a fierceness that mirrored our quiet resurrection. Daniel spent his mornings in the garden we'd built together, planting seeds with a focus that felt almost spiritual. He said it reminded him that everything broken could be renewed, one root at a time. Sometimes, I'd watch from the porch, seeing the man my husband had always hoped he'd become. Grief had shaped him, but love had refined him. I began teaching again, though not in schools. Life had become my classroom. A few women from nearby towns started visiting, drawn by stories of how we had rebuilt after ruin. They came with their own tales, betrayal, loss, regret, and I listened, offering tea, warmth, and truth. "I'm not a saint," I'd tell them. "I just survived long enough to see why things had to fall apart." They always left lighter than they arrived. It struck me that maybe this was my purpose now, to turn pain into guidance. One afternoon, Daniel arrived home carrying a small box. He set it on the kitchen table and said, "A gift for everything you did for me." Inside was a handmade plaque carved from driftwood. It read, "Home isn't a place. It's who you become after the fire." I ran my fingers over the words, feeling tears gather in my eyes. He smiled shyly. "I think Dad would have liked it." We hung the plaque by the front door, the wood catching the golden light of evening. Every time the sun set, it glowed softly, like a promise kept. The house felt alive, not with wealth, but with warmth. Neighbors started visiting, drawn by the garden, the laughter, the peace that seemed to radiate from our walls. No one would have guessed that once, this same family had been torn apart by deceit. But that's the beauty of renewal. It doesn't erase the scars, it honors them. That night, we celebrated with a simple dinner by the lake, grilled vegetables, homemade bread, and soft music playing from Daniel's phone. As we ate, he said, "You know, Mom, if Clara hadn't done what she did, we wouldn't be here." I looked at him, surprised by the serenity in his tone. "You're right," I said. "Sometimes it takes destruction to reveal where true strength lives." We clinked our glasses softly, not in triumph, but in quiet gratitude. Because healing, I realized, is not about returning to who you were, it's about becoming who you were meant to be. When the stars appeared, I looked at the reflection on the lake, calm, vast, eternal. The past no longer haunted me. It had become my teacher. Daniel's laughter drifted through the night, mixing with the sound of the crickets. I thought of my husband, of the home we'd lost, and of the peace we'd found in its place. And for the first time in a lifetime, I didn't need to write the ending in my notebook, because I was already living it. Years have passed since the storm that once tore through our lives, but sometimes I still wake up before dawn, listening to the quiet. The lake outside remains still, reflecting a peace we fought to earn. Daniel's laughter fills the mornings again. He's married now, to a woman gentle and grounded, nothing like the past that almost destroyed him. They built their home nearby, and on weekends, my grandson runs through the garden I once planted to heal. Life, it seems, knows how to return everything, not as it was, but as it should be. And as I watch them, I finally understand love, when purified by pain, becomes wisdom. I spend my days writing letters now, not to anyone in particular, but to time itself. Letters of gratitude, regret, forgiveness, and hope. Sometimes I reread the earliest pages of my notebook, where my words were still bleeding, angry, raw. They feel like they belong to someone else, a woman who hadn't yet learned the meaning of surrender. Suffering taught me what comfort never could, that peace isn't found in control, but in acceptance. And that even when everything falls apart, the soul remains indestructible. One afternoon, I sat by the porch, the breeze carrying the scent of the lake and wildflowers. A neighbor's child passed by, waving, and I smiled, the kind of smile that comes from surviving what once seemed impossible. She asked, "Is it true that your family lost everything once?" I nodded and replied, "We did, but that's how we found everything that truly mattered." She looked puzzled, then smiled, as if half understanding something she would one day live herself. That's how truth travels, not through sermons, but through stories. Daniel visits often, bringing his son, who calls me Nana. He tells me about his work, the families he helps rebuild after disasters, the people who remind him of who he once was. Every time I see his hands, strong, steady, scarred, I remember the boy who once trembled holding a foreclosure letter. Now those same hands build hope for others. Sometimes he asks if I ever think about Clara, and I tell him the truth. Not with pain anymore, only with understanding. Because even those who destroy us are teachers, disguised in cruel lessons. At night, I sit by the window, the notebook on my lap nearly full. I write the last words with trembling hands, not from age, but from emotion. When you lose everything, don't despair. Maybe life is simply clearing space for truth. I close it gently and place it on the shelf beside my husband's photo, whispering, "We did it, love. We turned pain into peace." Outside, the moon shimmers over the water, and I hear the faint laughter of my grandson from across the garden. And in that sound, pure, free, innocent, I find the melody of every prayer I ever spoke. I no longer fear endings. I've learned that every ending carries a seed that grows quietly, patiently, waiting for the right season to bloom. We lost wealth, comfort, and illusions, but we gained something far greater: wisdom, humility, and love that no deceit could touch. If I've learned one truth worth passing on, it's this: never let betrayal harden you, for even the heart that's been broken can still teach compassion. That, I realize now, is the last and greatest lesson of all.